I'd really like to welcome Sonya Voumard and Penelope Cottier and Nick Hartland to this little conversation about their prize-winning books for the 2040 prize for 2024, books that we're publishing on the 26th of October. So obviously, there's nothing that necessarily unites two books, one fiction and one non-fiction, that happen to have won the 2040 prize in the same year. But it's engaging to me, and I hope to our readers, to your readers, that both books do share an interest in how imposed social norms impinge on who we are in the world. I think there's a connection there. Tremor does give the reader moving insight into how people with disabilities wrestle with implicit social expectations and judgments in the world. And it might also be argued that the Putin doubles in the 31 legs of Vladimir Putin capture how we are all numbed into acceptance by the political systems that we live in and that govern us. So to start teasing this out, Sonya, I wanted to ask you about one aspect of Tremor. It gives a really vital sense of how your own growing understanding of living in a body that doesn't fully obey you. It isn't completely under your control. And in that, you're briding and rebelling against that as a young person, but eventually arriving at some sort of acceptance, maybe grudging acceptance at that daunting reality. And the irony here is that perhaps that lack of control is actually true for everyone at some level, but people with a disability are made to face it. And firstly, tell us a little about your disability, dystonia, and what do you think of the relationship we have with the cards our genetics deal us?
Sure. Thank you very much, Julian, and thank you for being in the book scene and providing this incredible opportunity for us to be published. I'm very honoured to be one of the winners, and I'm sure I speak for just about everybody who has won the prize to date. So thank you for that. So the disorder that I have is called dystonia, as you said. It's a movement disorder with some things that are similar to Parkinson's in the sense of that it involves bodily tremors. I had a bodily tremor from a very young age, probably since I was about 13. But I also noticed when I was very young that my father had it. And I thought that it was sort of a sign of when he was doing something important, or he was busy, or he was racing to get to work, that this tremor connoted importance of a sort. It was ironic in a sense that when he died prematurely, I began to notice a tremor in my left hand. And it didn't really worry me because I spoke to doctors about it, and my mother and various people, and everyone said, oh, it's an essential tremor. A lot of people have them. It's not anything to worry too much about. And it really wasn't at that time. And in fact, as I say in the book, it ended up being a bit of a sort of a fashion accessory at certain times when I was sort of hanging around the punk scene in the late 70s, early 80s. But it got worse over time, and it particularly showed itself when I was working in Canberra as a journalist, and I suddenly got these terrible tremors or in fact, they weren't tremors, they were spasms in my neck when I was driving. And I got this terribly stiff neck. I couldn't move it. I had to take several weeks off work. Nobody could work out what it was, but nobody at that time connected it with the tremor. So to get back to the question about genetics, it is largely thought to be a genetic condition, or at least that's one of the reasons one gets it. And then apparently, nurture or lack of nurture, whatever you want to call it, does the rest. So the genetics provide the fertile ground, and then what happens to you in your life will impact how the tremor will come on. So the relationship with genetics, I think that they define so much of who we are. I think we all have a bit of a love-hate relationship with our genetics, in the sense of that they are very determining of our perfections and our imperfections. The answer to me is, do I dislike or like my genetics? I struggle with them, but I also value them because they make me who I am.
Yes, that's a lovely way of thinking about it. And I think, as I was intimating in the question, people with a disability like yours are made to face it, where we all have things that limit us and control us. But in some ways, that one of the compensating virtues of having something that separates you from normality, in inverted commas, is it makes you value what you do have. So I think that's lovely in your summation of how you relate to your own genetic inheritance. So now that we've introduced the idea of a genetic inheritance or legacy, let's turn our attention to our other prize-winning book, The 31 Legs of Vladimir Putin, and get Nick and Penelope to join the conversation. The characters in your book bear a surprising resemblance to Vladimir Putin. And because of this, they are targeted as possible stand-ins for the president. And this somewhat loopy premise sets up a range of comedic tensions and possibilities that will be fun to tease out with you. But first of all, can you give us a picture of your early shared thinking as you arrived at the concept and shape of this book? I seem to remember you saying you were on holidays and the idea germinated somehow. Can you give us a little picture of what happened to take you on this fun journey?
We were in Queensland on a bird watching trip where the idea first came. I think we'd had a few drinks that night and we'd read something about Putin, because it's hard to go a day without seeing a reference to Putin. And it just occurred, I think I came up with the idea of having a certain number of legs of the people who represented Putin, who were recruited to represent Putin. We started working on it, and then we saw this prize as a possible timeline we could work to finishing the book. But Queensland is to blame for the Putin.
Queensland and a few drinks.
Yeah.
I took a number of things that have been caused by a few drinks that are interesting in the world.
It started really with talking about Putin and the idea of Putin doubles. It started with Putin, and he's a compelling character, whatever you might want to say about his influence. He does dominate. And
yeah, he's everywhere. I went to an exhibition of Vincent Mamadira at the gallery here in Canberra. That's the one that had the Gina Reinhardt picture in it, but it also had one of Putin riding a horse without any top on, that famous image. So wherever you go, there's something about Putin.
Yes, he's very present in our world, unfortunately, in many ways. But part of the enjoyment in your book is the puzzle-like question of all these men being united by their appearance and their possible roles of Putin double and who they may themselves be otherwise. How much was a puzzle around the identity of our Putins in the book at the center of your thinking as you started framing how this fun journey you were making would take shape?
I think it's core, because the idea was, if you're a Putin double, how would you construct your identity? And biology has given you, as Penelope says, this wonderful chance. The characters have to make something of it. So it is essentially about how they construct their identity within that constraint. And I think, we all construct our identity out of the things that nature, nurture, society gives around us. And for these people, while there's obviously some money involved and, the chance maybe to be great for some of them, whatever that might mean for them, it also constrains them. And so their experience of themselves and trying to find the real person behind their constructed identity as a Putin double is really the kind of core of many of their dilemmas. Yeah, so
it's also about capitalism, the old notion of alienation, that even these people's faces have been monetized. And of course, we see this sort of thing in influencers and so on. But here, they just happen to have been born with a particular face. Their face is no longer their own, literally. It's harnessed to a system, and there's no way out of that. Even those who decide not to take the money and be paid to be Putin doubles, they're still teased about looking like Putin. So you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. But there is that thing about how anything can be monetized in our society.
Yes, that's really fun, because, of course, the likelihood of anyone, or at least many people, looking like Putin is very small, but we do tend to normalize our appearance to fit in. So there's a nice kind of double meaning there, I think, throughout the book, about the way we make ourselves into normalized versions of reality because we want to be accepted. So it's quite fun. Yeah. So
Nick looks vaguely like Vladimir Putin.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, I have been accused occasionally of looking like Putin. But I think,
you haven't been offered a stipend yet, though.
Perhaps I'll after the books out there in the world.
Yeah.
Yes, but you never know.
Yeah.
So while the men in 31 Legs of Vladimir Putin are united by their appearance, in Tremor, your book, Sonya, keeping up with appearances is a challenge. And you write about having a relatively invisible disability and what you've gone through trying to disguise its symptoms in public to avoid judgment. Interestingly, a number of the key players for whom you attempted to hide your shaking later told you that they didn't think less of you for who you are. And I just wonder what overall perspectives you have on the effect of social norms and expectations on people with disability.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think the people who said that they didn't think less of me when I actually asked them about my tremor, if they'd noticed it, I think I probably wouldn't have asked them if I thought they weren't very nice people. So it was probably not a terribly accurate scientific sample. But
Yes.
I know from my own intuition that there have been incidents where I have been in a room of powerful people, or I've had to have an interaction with somebody who I've needed to either impress or not unimpress. And I've gone to lengths to hide it because I've worried that it would seem like either a weakness, something that would make them think less of me, perhaps distrust me, or think I had a problem that meant that I wasn't going to be capable of a particular job or something like that. And I think, it's interesting because I was reflecting on this earlier that, and Penelope, you can probably relate to this, but as a woman in the workforce, it's often said that you have to work a lot harder than men. Well, as a woman with a disorder like I've got, that adds further labor to the amount of work you have to do to impress, I guess.
Yes, I can see that it could be very true. Yes, and I mean, your own journey towards seeking medical intervention, the big step you eventually take, drives the narrative of the book, and everything else hangs off that. What were some truly salient forces that pushed and pulled you in that difficult process of deciding whether you would have real intervention? Yeah.
Sure. And interestingly, I spoke to my GP about it over the years, and he said, look, it's an essential tremor. There's nothing that can really be done. They can give you various medications, but they don't help much. So I just thought, oh, it's just something I'm going to have to live with. And at this stage as well, I didn't realize that the neck spasms were related to the hand tremor. I just thought it was overuse of computers. So when I was at dinner with some neighbours, actually, one of whom was a very senior radiologist at St Vincent's, and she said, I think it's an essential tremor, and there are things that can actually be done about it. There's this new treatment. And she said she'd read about it in the medical journals, and anyway, she put me onto this Dr. Stephen Tish, who ended up being who is my neurologist. What did I hope to get out of the treatment? Obviously, it was hope for a good outcome. It was an expensive procedure. I was pleased that it didn't involve cutting my head. It was involved sending rays into my brain, and burning a section of it. But I did have to have my head shaved, so that was pretty radical. It was also, to me, an adventure. It was an adventure that felt like not a huge risk, even though it was a bit of a risk. And I've always been a bit of a risk taker, but it also felt like it was a reasonable risk to take for the potential of a good outcome, which was to steady my right hand so that I can actually carry a cup of tea across the room.
Indeed, that's a reasonable ambition, Sonya. Yeah, so Nick and Penelope, going back to the 31 Legs of Vladimir Putin, I love saying the title of your book, by the way. The doubles in the book have an engaging range of hopes and delusions about their role as it would be Putin. And whether they're relatively reluctant targets or happy for the outcome of getting a little money, or have more grandiose plans that evolve as they dream about the role, they're all made to wait for a call to action that may never come. And how much was a sense of the frustrations of labyrinthine bureaucratic procedures on the real world key to your writing? And obviously I thought of bits of literature like Borges and Kafka. Wondered how much these things were a spur to your writing, or whether it's just your own wonderful folly.
I think we wanted to capture in the book some of that. I think Kafka brings out well, like the feeling of powerlessness that an individual confronted by a wider system can feel, and the arbitrariness and mystery of those systems but a bit updated, I think, in a way from Kafka. I think now, with the decline of mediating institutions like unions, political parties, civic associations, people feel a direct connection to individuals, to either Putin or Trump or whoever it might be. And that's very attractive for a whole range of people, but really quite isolating. And I think it drives a lot of people mad. And so I wanted to sort of capture that, I think, modern condition about people feeling closer than ever to international leaders and figures, but actually more isolated and powerless. And I think you can see that in some of the conspiracy theorists that are starting to dominate political discourse. Obviously, the Putin dilemmas are a bit different to that, but that sense of isolation, and we did want to capture, and confusion, we wanted to capture in the characters.
But also, from the beginning, wanted a fairly light tone in general to bring out how ludicrous the notion is that someone would be recruited on the way they look. It's like living in a sort of joke to which the punchline never arrives on the one hand. At the same time, the punchline is always there. You are the punchline. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the tone varies throughout the book, but it needs to have that comedy driving it, I think, because the whole thing, of course, it's a fantasy. I don't really believe the FSB goes around the world recruiting Putin lookalikes.
You don't, Penelope. I'm surprised. No, I think that comedic element is very lightly done, but it builds certain patterns that are interesting for the reader. And of course, some of the characters get carried away with the extremity of the possibilities that they can imagine this situation. Of course, making your characters doubles for a person on the international stage in the real world, we're touching on this, and I think you were saying, Nick, about modern media. That's fascinating. How famous people can seem very immediate to you, and they can seem to represent you in ways that perhaps in the traditional media they were far more distant. The book hints and moves around such questions. With the freedom of fiction, how much was choosing Vladimir Putin as your model an important decision? Do you see any sort of equation between Putin's role and decision-making in the real world and the delusions of some of your Putin doubles?
I mean, he's such a broad canvas, and the characters pick up and he's been on the international stage for so long, much longer than most democratically elected leaders could manage, obviously. Yes. And so the book does pick up the phases of his life, from the young thug through to the KGB officer, through to the mayoral candidate, running the FSB, and then running, his commercial interests. So each of the characters could actually refer to a facet of this man whose presence has, and persona has evolved quite radically over the last 30 years. I mean, it takes a bit of time to remember now, but originally he was seen as a liberal. Of course, now that's proven to be incorrect, whether he's changed or actually our understanding of him has changed for whatever reason. And so the book does try to pick up all those facets of his life. And I guess it's convenient in a way that he has so many facets that you could have a lot of characters illustrating one of those facets or another in their relationship to him. And it gave the book a kind of nice differentiation between the characters. So one would talk about his approach to Orthodox Christianity. There was another who was referencing his time as a young thug. And of course, the others talk about his spycraft. So he gave us so many facets to create characters around.
I hadn't thought of that before you said it. Sounds good, though.
I think, Penelope, why you haven't focused on that is because it's very lightly done. The book isn't about Vladimir Putin. He's there hovering.
Yes.
And it's more about the minds of the doubles, but he's there hovering, and that's the nice balance. And that's why I asked you how much you chose him because of the political figure he is, or how much he was a convenient character to employ. And I think you've explained how it kind of crosses both things. But essentially the book is a comedic ride through these characters dealing with being placed in a strange position where they're waiting to be called on to act at cocktail parties or whatever for him while he's doing something more important. And that's a very fun premise. So, Sonya, Tremor also engages with the wider world, interestingly, and I think this is a very salient thing about your book, because it's not just a story of your voyage. You look beyond your own story, and one of the admirable things about your approach to the book is the empathetic eye you bring to thinking about the wider picture of other sufferers from disability. How was this overview informed by your work as a journalist, and how much by your growing appreciation of your own situation and being empathetic to others, the combination of that journalist's eye and your own realization of your own situation?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about that, people in journalism often talk about taking out their mental notebook when they feel uncomfortable. And we do that a lot, I think, because perhaps it's not as much the case as it used to be, but to be a journalist and working for a mainstream newspaper was, 20 or 30 years ago, quite a powerful position to be in. So you felt that you could, at any time, if one was uncomfortable, you could take out your mental notebook and feel sort of somewhat elevated by the status that you had, and that would somehow kind of submerge any vulnerability you might have. So it was a combination of taking out my mental notebook about myself and seeing this as a story that enabled me to cope with it, I think. And secondly, I have a close friend at work who is in her 30s now, but when she was 22, she had an aneurysm, and basically her whole career was severely curtailed by having had this aneurysm, which she almost died from. And she and I became quite friendly about 10 years ago through work, and I ended up doing a story about her. And I think that now when I think about it, there was a sort of a gateway from her experience into my own, because when I started to go on this discovery journey of finding out exactly what the tremor and the spasms and all of that were about, she was kind of at my side, and we talked a lot about neurology and about, what it was like to have an MRI for 45 minutes and how best to handle it and all of that stuff. But more broadly, the empathetic question, I guess, is, especially as I've got older, I think I've been less egocentric as a journalist and more outward looking. And I think felt the pain of others more readily. And when I started to read about people who had dystonia, who have it, in fact, in a much worse way than I do, there were people whose careers had been destroyed and, whose heads went to one side and never came back and all of that sort of stuff. And not only that, who were considered sort of mad because of the way they behaved. And so through, yes, my own experience, I guess, as a journalist and as a sufferer of dystonia, kind of those two things came together, and I wanted to include them in my story as well.
Wonderful, because it's such a key aspect of the book that we get a sense of other people around you and your experience of coming to terms with their stories as well as your own. So it's a wonderful thing. So turning our attention now actually for a moment from the writing of your books and what they are to the experience of winning the prize, which obviously Finlay Lloyd is very excited about, trying to promote shorter works between 20 and 40,000 words, fiction and non-fiction, and trying to identify them through the prize and publish them to create an interest in this sort of length of fiction and non-fiction that we think is such a fun thing and such an important thing to encourage. How has the experience of being involved as prize winners been so far?
I really love the commitment to the physical object of the book. I think as a reader, that tactile sense is really important. And I really like short form novellas. We'll often seek them out. If there's a choice between a long, 900 pages and a 100-page book, I'll always take the 100, because I think that's just it's the right form. On the editing process, which I think really is part of your practice, to be very heavily involved in the editing. And I think it felt like more an engagement with a really deeply committed reader than another author. So a reader trying to make sure that the story and that the words and structure of the words expressed what was the kernel of our intention for each of the little vignettes in the book. So that was a really interesting process.
I think too, given that they both are about how we appear in the world, it seems appropriate that so much care has gone into the way the books look. They look great. The covers are fantastic. Just on a personal note, most of my publications have been poetry. At a reading 2 years ago, a young man said to me, "Oh, it's interesting you do so much narrative poetry." And I thought, what? And he was right. So I guess this is the perfect form, perhaps, for someone who's used to short poems. Being able to say something in a few words translates quite well to a novella.
Yeah, well, I'm glad both those things matter to you, because we care a lot about books as artifacts. We like the book as such a wonderfully versatile physical object, and we care a lot about the way it looks, and we want people want to hold them. So that's lovely you feel that. And we do also care intensely about trying to help writers create the best version of their book. So I'm glad both those things worked for you. And Sonya, do you want to tell me that you're very unhappy with the whole process, or do you?
No, I don't want to tell you that. I want to say that it's been an incredible process, actually. I've loved it, even though at times, I suppose, it has demanded a lot of me and you, probably, Julian. But I've learned a lot as a writer through the process, and I've never had access to such an attentive and committed editor before, which, you know, has been an honor. It's made a much better outcome than I ordinarily would have had. And I would also say that, you know, when I was studying my master's and my doctorate at UTS, the kind of prevailing thinking was that all books, you know, all manuscripts had to be around 55, 60,000 words, or they weren't commercially, you know, worth even looking at. And I felt with my book that I was constantly trying to make it into 55 or 60,000 words. And I think the right amount for it is what it is now. I think there's a muscularity to it and a tautness that is really artful and welcome. So yeah, I have nothing but praise.
Well, that's wonderful. And it is such an interesting thing about the commercial reality of publishing. And that's a long story. But it's fortunately for Finlay Lloyd, it's not something that concerns us. And perhaps with a little ironical twist, a lot of short form fiction has been very successful recently. So I think it's always dangerous for publishers to try and second guess the world. It's better if they lead. And that's what we try to do. So thank you for your lovely comments. And obviously, we hope that lots of people will enjoy reading your wonderful books.